My name is Martin McCracken. I'm from the University Business School here, based in Northern Ireland, in Belfast. And it's a great pleasure today to be hosting this event. This is a knowledge into practice event, and this is part of the PrOPEL Hub. The PrOPEL Hub is basically a research study that involving 7 universities in the United Kingdom, and we're very much looking at the whole issue about productivity and workplace engagement. And obviously, we've been through a lot over the last number of years in terms of the COVID pandemic, and that has really changed the landscape for a lot of people in terms of work and how work is organized and how people actually go to work and contribute to their organization's objectives, etc. So very much what we're interested in today is to talk about some of those issues, to think about this idea of a new normal, if there is such a thing as a new normal. I mean, we all understand that workplaces are continually evolving, and perhaps this issue of flexible working and hybrid working has been accelerated very much as a result of our experiences throughout the pandemic. So today we've got a very good lineup here of speakers. So I'll introduce those first. Obviously, here we've got Dr Denise Currie, and Denise is a colleague from Queen's University Belfast, the School of Management. Denise very much interested in the whole issue of work and organisation, speciality very much looking at negotiation and conflict issues, but also interested very much in well-being, and is just involved in a major study looking at well-being within the National Health Service at the moment, and very much thinking about how the impact of the pandemic on the workplace of the National Health Service and for employees within that sector. We've also got, sorry, I'm just going to move this poll here. We've also got Michelle Lestas, and Michelle again is an entrepreneur and champion of entrepreneurial employees and entrepreneurial work. Very much this idea of the InBizTogether network is there to try and understand issues connected to entrepreneurial work, to small businesses, micro businesses, some of the kind of issues which they face from day to day, and also think about this kind of strategic future of such organizations. And we're very much delighted to have Michelle here with us because, as I said, this is a knowledge into practice session, and we really want to try and think about some of those kind of academic type issues and research issues, but how does this really play out in practice on the ground for employees and entrepreneurs trying to think about growing businesses. So it's great to have Michelle with us. And finally, we've got Marek Zemanik, who is from the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. And Marek, again, is the Senior Policy Officer for Northern Ireland and Scotland. So Marek will bring a lot of expertise to bear in terms of what's happening in the kind of wider environment in terms of the policy and research fields, in terms of workplaces and how workplaces have evolved and changed as a result of the pandemic. So, as I said, I mean, really, this is a knowledge into practice session. And what we're trying to do here is spend some time thinking about some of the kind of key issues which have evolved, and our speakers are going to highlight some of those. We want to try and make this as interactive as we possibly can. So we would encourage you to use the chat, and we've got a number of kind of questions we're going to set up here. My colleague Daria is going to manage that, and we're going to try and dip into that chat now and again to try and take out some of those kind of issues which you're going to want us to speak about, and to try to cover as much ground. I mean, as I said, we really want to try and make this a session about you. This is something that I'm sure maybe we've been to a few of these sessions previously for looking at the whole issue about hybrid work and the two-tier employment situation. Some people can work from home, others perhaps can't. What do we do about this on the actual ground on the workplace? And this is really an opportunity which we hope we will be able to have a fairly rounded discussion about these issues. As you can see, we've also got a poll set up in terms of the sectors, just to see where people are coming from today. So if you would complete that as well. And at the end, we will have a kind of feedback question as well for the poll as well. But without further ado, what I'd like to do is invite Dr Denise Currie here to talk about some of the kind of key issues which is happening in terms of her research and some of the kind of how the landscape has changed in terms of hybrid working and the new normal workplace. So Denise, if I can invite you to come along now.
Okay, thanks Martin, and thanks very much for inviting me to contribute to this panel. Now, I've been given the task to really set the scene around this issue, and to be honest, it's quite a task given the amount of research and ongoing debate and experimentation really about, how best organisations can adapt to this new normal and new employee demands, let's say, for hybrid working and for that to continue. So, there's quite a number of interesting research projects out there that I'd just like to highlight, but overall, there's a number of themes that we really want to discuss. It's impossible to go through them all in detail, but I'll maybe highlight a few in particular. So hopefully everybody can see my screen here. Yeah. Okay, so let's see. So sorry, just bear with me 1 wee second. Okay. So actually a new piece of research from Leeds University has highlighted the various different modes of hybrid working in terms of time as hybrid, fixed hybrid, free hybrid, nomadic hybrid, balanced hybrids. So as you will all be aware, organisations are trying to grapple with this new normal and the various different models of hybridity that can be adopted depending on what organisations are encouraging employees to comply with or to the degree to their flexibility. So just to note as well, a recent piece of research based in the US now, however, it's still quite interesting, from Barrow, Bloom and Davis, is that in terms of hybrid models, where actually there's a push to, for example, organizations to bring back working in the office 5 days a week as normal, there's actually less than a 50% rate of compliance. So and even for firms that are pushing 4 days or less are actually seeing over an 80% compliance with that. So that kind of shows you the demand that change is necessary and that change is here to stay. And it's also important to bear in mind, I suppose, the reasons from an employee perspective about why they want to maintain that level of flexibility or at least go back into the office to some degree. And that same piece of research established that that face-to-face collaboration, socializing and work personal life boundaries are key reasons for why individuals want some level of hybridities and not fully remote, but the option to go into the office for some of those days. So here you'll see that within that context, however, and the kind of decisions organizations need to make about models of hybridity, there's a number of considerations. And they're listed here on this slide. It's not feasible to go into these into a lot of detail, but I will select a few. So firstly, in terms of productivity, engagement and performance management, this is a really interesting area. And there's been a wealth of research already done before and after the pandemic that suggests actually that working flexibly and working from home enhances productivity. Maybe through time saving on commute, fewer distractions at home, but it's also, potentially work intensification, which is maybe sometimes can be a concern. Employees maintain that, yes, they can work more flexibly and still do their jobs, be productive and meet the same outcomes, and that's important. But I suppose from the employer's point of view, some employers will have concerns about productivity of workers if adopting hybrid or remote working. But I think, a lot of these concerns often relate to this control-based management style that emphasizes inputs to be monitored as opposed to actually outputs and contribution. And I suppose, when organizations do take this perspective, you can see that they've been influenced to adopt various different surveillance and monitoring technologies. But obviously that can be met with a lot of resistance from employees. So I suppose what's really critical in this space is organizations really need to consider how best to manage performance. And it's critical to ensure that employees can benefit from some sort of hybrid working, while also ensuring that our objectives can be met. So I'm just going to throw out a few questions in this area. These are the things that organizations need to consider. So firstly, what's the purpose or the goals of being present in work for various different departments and teams or for specific roles? how legitimate is that demand for employees to return to the office then, and do these reasons, I suppose, align with the organisation's values? But how can productivity be more effectively managed is key, considering goal setting, interdependence of team and tasks, the establishment of more trusting relationships. So overall, these things need considered. Now, remote working requires a transition to trust-based relationships as to opposed to control-based. So this leads us on quite nicely then to the importance of line management. And often line managers feel under-trained or under-equipped to manage remotely or in a hybrid way. So you need to ask yourselves, I suppose, how well trained are our line managers in managing and supervising work remotely? Or and as well, if you're offering that training, do line managers actually have the time to commit to those initiatives, given that they're always too busy? So these are the key questions that you need to answer. And I suppose as well is what is a variation of approaches across line managers as well, because that variation in terms of how policies are implemented can often create disagreements, problems, grievances across different cohort or different units of employees. I'm going to go on to collaborative working now and set the scene there in terms of the key issues. Now, this is a really kind of interesting debate at the minute. You know, I'm sure you've all heard Elon Musk saying, yeah, you can work flexibly as long as you're in the office for 40 hours a week. And that's really about ensuring, you know, trying to capitalize on the moments for collaboration and collaborative working. And I suppose this concerns is not only from employers, but from employees as well, in that sometimes models of hybrid working can sandwich opportunities for that collaboration and creativity and problem solving. And I suppose, you know, many are concerned about the potential for serendipity or those water cooler moments to be diminished. But again, at the end of the day, if collaborative working is still achievable in remote working environments, if indeed the task interdependence is there, where work is coordinated across teams, requiring team interaction, and of course using appropriate communication channels. But I think what's really interesting in this area is, in terms of collaborative working, it's about the team relationships. These are instrumental. So for sharing knowledge. And I suppose if an entirely remote model is adopted, how do you ensure that those team relationships are maintained? And that's probably the difficulty. And as well, you know, interpersonal relationships with team members is really key for new starts as well, and that's important. And as well, you know, for having some kind of hybrid approach for nipping any disagreements or conflict in the bud from the outset. So I suppose key questions in this area: how can work processes, tasks, workloads, goals be managed to avoid that silo working and instead be used to promote greater team interdependence and connectivity? So again, looking at the design of work and the design of roles and jobs, but as well, how are teams using ICT? Are they using them to their full capacity in a hybrid model, or is it more redundant? How can trust amongst team members be established and maintained in that hybrid model? Maybe intermittent face-to-face team building days are a useful complement to remote working, and often that is being experimented with at the minute. And as well, team members also need to be conflict competent in dealing with task and interpersonal conflicts in this kind of more hybrid environment. I just want to check for time, Daria or Martin, if you'd like me to move on, I'll just quickly talk about some equality, diversity and inclusion issues. Sorry, you're on mute. You're on mute there, Martin. Anyway,
Denise, there was a question by one of our attendants. I don't know if I forgot her name, but I think it was Iraq or something. If you can ask your question now.
Yes, certainly.
Yeah, I had a question when you were talking about the new normal, and I see that it's specifically taken into consideration looking at the remote working option only, like because obviously, as I see that there are more changes as well that have happened after in the post COVID era. But let's just say if this is about the remote working and the surveillance and how employers or managers can really cater to productivity issues if employees have those while working hybrid. I've because my research is in a similar topic, and I've read a couple of researches which have been done in remote working, not in the COVID era but earlier, and it says that the trust relationship is really important, and it kind of I don't know if it's the right word to use, but let's just put it this way, that it offends the employees to be into any surveillance if they are undergoing any surveillance procedures, because they feel that their work is not being trusted. And I understand that there's the employer's perspective of ensuring that the productivity is enhanced, because generally in the workplace they are able to see employees. So this is really like a debate where, because I'm really looking at the balance in employment relationships, which happens in such working conditions. And I would like to know how would you want to, respond to this, because it's also going to be useful for my research if both parties have valid concerns, and how do we like really strike a balance as per you or your knowledge in such situations?
Yeah. I mean, just to caveat before Denise, you come in. I mean, I think you've kind of got to the heart of the issue here that we're all thinking about, Iraq, and this issue about balance. To my mind, I think the whole idea about trust comes to the fore, and the trust is a word that we sometimes throw out there, and we think, okay, well, how do we get trust and relationship? But it's such a big factor. And how does trust emerge? It emerges through time, through experience, through proximity, through understanding, and seeing how we've worked in the past together. The big issue with this all is that there's this lack of proximity, there's this lack of visibility, and how do we try to really get a grasp of what trust really means in this new environment? And I think that is the big issue which we really need to try and get some answers to. So I think you've really got to the heart of the issue there in terms of this idea of the balance, surveillance versus letting people having some empowerment and ownership and those things to get on with their job. That is what all managers seem to be grappling with at the moment. But I mean, I think that you've really got to the heart of the issue here in terms of hybrid working. I mean, Denise, did you anything else you wanted to add to that?
Well, just in terms of job design in itself, in terms of what's expected and how that relates obviously to performance management and the objectives that are set. So it's about more of an outcome focused performance management system as opposed to any way of monitoring of employees, and I think that's really key. But obviously that's going to be much easier to do for some roles compared to others, and this is the challenge. It's then if you're adopting a different approach for some roles in an organization compared to others, how is that perceived across the workforce in terms of fairness and consistency? And therefore the rationale and the justification around how legitimate those differences are needs to be very well communicated to employees. Employees, if they are expected to be on site, for example, need to understand the purpose of that and what they are contributing to the organisation by being on site. So it's a big piece around communication and ensuring employees understand the rationale behind decisions that are made. But I mean, I think in terms of that surveillance, that's maybe it was a knee-jerk reaction from a lot of organizations in the pandemic, but it has been met with lots of resistance. And to be honest, there's some ethical concerns around that area as well. So I think organizations certainly need to be encouraged to look at different ways and take more systemic approach, particularly looking at job design.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking there, Marek, I don't know if you've anything to come in here in the kind of the CIPD angle on this. I mean, is this something that surveillance, whenever we talk about surveillance, I guess it's quite a edgy, controversial type area, especially that we think about this idea, especially people at home, they're out with the kind of formal workplace even though they are in the workplace. And this idea of surveillance it's a bit of a, as Denise mentioned, this kind of ethical issues coming in here as well. Is there any kind of viewpoint from CIPD on what's happening there and where it should go?
Well, interestingly, this is actually one of the first papers I think we may have published during the pandemic, where we looked at surveillance specifically, mostly around the sort of academic research, and then tried to translate it into some practitioner recommendations. But I mean, I think overall, this view that it was a bit of a, let's say, knee-jerk reaction by some is I think something that we would agree with. I think you know, ultimately, and it's been mentioned here before, this all comes down to trust, and it comes down to trust between employers, managers, and employees. And this trust, Martin, you mentioned proximity is one of the factors, could be one of the factors, but one of the key factors is actually communication as well. And that is speaking to your employees, understanding their concerns, understanding their preferences, and also communicating the employer side and the employer's perspective and the employer's views, of course, openly as well. Now, the evidence that we have seen during the pandemic, we do quite a lot of research around job quality, for example, and the evidence suggests that very little has actually changed as a result of the pandemic, which was perhaps surprising, but it just shows you that job quality, both good quality and poor quality, is actually quite sticky and quite resistant to change. But the one thing that did change was actually the employee voice bit. That companies actually did put a lot more effort in communicating with their employees, and not just through collective voice, where there are collective voice arrangements, but individual relationships as well. And a lot more effort was put on that, and some of that seems to have survived post-pandemic, if we can call it post-pandemic as well. And if that is something that stays with us, that is certainly one of the very positive outcomes of the upheaval we have seen over the last 2 years. I'm staying away from surveillance. Surveillance, you know, we would say it should be, if it is put in place, it should be justified, it should be proportionate, it should be clearly communicated, it should be explained why this is happening, what is expected with the employees. But yeah, there are some very significant concerning issues with that, as Denise has already mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, no, absolutely. I mean, and I think the kind of key issues which you're talking about there, I mean, in terms of organizations, really thinking about communication. I mean, this is, whenever we were all in the workplace together, there was lots of informal and conversation chats, and now that can lead to problems as well in terms of consistency. But because we weren't in the office, because we were working remotely, I think there had to be some formal mechanism for communication. So this, I guess, is one thing that you're talking about there, a good aspect that's come out in terms of much more consistent, kind of clearer communication, going both from the employer to the employee and vice versa, looking for feedback. So, you know, again, the challenge is, how do we keep that? How do we keep that going as we, I guess, begin to think about this hybrid working environment, this new normal environment as well? So no, that I think that was really, and thanks very much for that question and moving the conversation on towards that area. I'm conscious that we've got Michelle here as well, and I'm thinking about from the entrepreneur, small business type perspective, and you know, a lot of the issues linked to just the pounds and pence, the infrastructure, the tangible issue of offices, and having offices that perhaps are not been fully utilized these days. I mean, is that something that we need to think about as well as we move forward?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Yeah, I mean, and I suppose if we think about SMEs in the context, I would think about them in the context of the Northern Ireland size, rather than your EU size, which is maybe 250 employees. I'm talking about the majority of small businesses, maybe 30 employees or less. So just to pick up, before I move on to the infrastructure, I think a really important point raised by Denise and the question in terms of trust. It's a really interesting one, and I was actually brought out a book last year, and I dedicated a section to it, because as entrepreneurs, we generally are, you know, quite control freaks, is the way I'd probably put it, and therefore, you know, when you're looking at entrepreneurs and micro businesses, it's very hard to trust and to give over some of that trust to employees. Now, traditionally, where we're quite good at it is in areas like sales or customer relations. And to pick up on Denise's point, that would be very much around where we have generally historically put together outputs and targets as opposed to inputs, but a lot of SME work is inputs. So I really think that we will catch up. But even though you might think an SME, it's small, it should be flexible, we should be able to react to this all very quickly. In fact, actually, we have a culture that doesn't necessarily allow us to do that. And then Martin's point, which is really important, you think about most SMEs when they hit the pandemic, working from home really wasn't on the agenda very much. Then you have this issue where rates and rent is a massive expenditure for SMEs. So they were tied into the physical infrastructure. So we're still at a point, I think, in work I'm doing, where we have to catch up and take a long-term approach. Even though you think we should be small and flexible, we're now only putting in place the strategies and ideas, think, okay, well, we're tied into that lease for another 3 years. So we have to try and work with what we've got, but accepting that a hybrid perhaps approach is definitely the way forward. We're not heading back to where we were. And so we need to be thinking strategically, and we need to be planning almost for that sort of working from home approach. So yes, I think for us as entrepreneurs, there's quite a few challenges for us ahead.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, and again, it's this estates and really trying to work out where are we going with all of this, and how do we square the circle in terms of having a location, but also getting the very best benefits which are coming from working from home as well. And that's a question, obviously, which we put in the chat there, just to try and think about what are some of the kind of key things which employers and organizations have implemented and brought in terms of the pandemic and some of the new initiatives that have come to the fore. I mean, just Denise, moving on from this in terms of that idea of kind of well-being and employee well-being. I mean, what are some of the things which are happening in terms of that to try to enhance some of the things that maybe that have happened in the workplace as a result of pandemic? Are there any things that you think that we should be keeping, or anything like that?
Well, firstly, can I just go back to I think Michelle's made an excellent point is in terms of infrastructure, but as well in terms of looking forward. A lot of organizations are thinking about as well how to make their offices attractive to employees so that they want to come into the office. I mean, I'm sure everyone knows of individuals at the minute they're complaining that they have to go into the office but they don't speak to anybody or are sitting on Teams all day. So it's about making that time in the office productive for what it should be in terms of the goals of the organization. And maybe it's about more kind of engineered collaboration or engineered team building or whatnot. But again, that takes a very strategic kind of planned approach as well. But in terms of well-being, absolutely. I mean, the pandemic really, exposed a lot of kind of concerns around well-being in the workplace. A lot of that, I suppose, from my research in the health and social care, and that included social workers who were all working from home, as well as kind of nurses and other social care workers going into work. So it was a really kind of broad church of employees. But still a key kind of factor that came in is this idea of boundary setting and the implications that had for well-being, particularly in working in these hybrid models or working with people in these hybrid models. So although you might be frontline, you'll be working potentially with managers, etc., in a hybrid model. And so there's lots of issues there. But essentially, it's we identified, boundaries are really important, but as well, boundaries are individual in a way, and some people will obviously prefer to have more segmentation compared to integration of those boundaries between work and home, and that will often depend on their own circumstances. So again, then it leads back to when those boundaries are not right for an individual, that leads to worse off well-being, more negative well-being outcomes. So what's the implications for that for an organisation? Firstly, in terms of that boundary setting, I suppose it needs to be thought about on an individual basis, which is really difficult, taking that person-centred approach. Everybody has various different commitments and so on. And that can be very difficult, because if you are doing that person-centred approach, then there's a perception from others that's, you know, not fair and consistent. So again, communication is really important to establish the rationale behind decisions around that. And then in terms of well-being, in our study, we identified a wealth of different initiatives that were implemented by organisations to help employee well-being throughout the time. I mean, you can imagine the HS, the health and social care workforce, were particularly challenged in that area. So, you know, but the key thing is although there's you know, a number of initiatives, they are welcomed. However, what was key is relationships and workload. So it's those key fundamental employee relations aspects that seem to be more influential in employee well-being outcomes, as opposed to whether they get to go to a yoga session or, you know, some of these these ad hoc initiatives. Not saying that they weren't welcome, they were appreciated, but in terms of the impact on well-being, there was other things that would make a much bigger impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you're talking there, and I'll open this out to Marek and Michelle as well. I mean, this idea of managers really been brave, and, you know, this idea of kind of yoga sessions and those things that I mean, we can be a little bit kind of, you know, flippant about and say they're just kind of things that are done padding around the edges. But at the end of the day, well-being is all about really looking at it on an individual basis and trying to delve into what are the circumstances for different individuals, different groups of individuals, and trying to get policy and practice aligned very much where we can understand, and this idea of allowing people to thrive. And that's the key challenge, because, I mean, ultimately a lot of this goes back to, we spoke about trust there, we spoke about, you know, the issue of thinking about strategic planning and where we're going to be, our estates, our tangible infrastructure. But a lot of this goes back to this idea of basic good management, basically being in touch with your employees, understanding what they need and trying to provide that for them as best you possibly can. You know, the whole transactional and relations, it goes right back to what we're thinking about in terms of leadership, and that's key to it. I mean, again, turning to Michelle and Marek, I mean, is there anything that you're seeing out there which is illustrating that good management come to the fore, or how can we enhance that?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things, and also with, you know, the woman ambassador hat on, I think one of the things in terms of well-being that we really have to address is this idea that when you're working from home, you know, particularly women, I do think, because their domestic chores, actually research is showing, has gone up since working from home men. But it's this idea of always being on. And I always, you know, over the years, like for the last 20 years, you know, people being self-employed and working from home has always been an isolating experience. And whenever this hit and the pandemic hit and more employees were starting to work, it was one of the things that for me, actually, I just thought this is just going to escalate now, because now we have not only self-employed people working from home and dealing with those isolation issues, but now we have a number of employees who are going to be dealing with that too. So really that, you know, good management, managers recognizing that this is now part and parcel of the working day. It's not an extra, it's not an add-on. That stress of feeling always on when you're working at home, and particularly for women, is something that's really important for good managers to get trained to understand. And, you know, in an entrepreneurial aspect, we would talk about, okay, get out, build your networks, build your relationships, get away from it. And an employee perspective, I'm assuming that that's about getting back into the office and having that sort of camaraderie. And maybe getting back into the office isn't just about the targets and the outputs. It actually has to be also about the camaraderie. And, you know, as entrepreneurs, we try and get that with our memberships and our networks and getting out and our conferences and so on. And for employees, you know, it's probably that bit about go back into the office, but hugely important. And we have to catch up, I think, with our policies and practices. And one last point on it before we, as SMEs, we're also struggling with the issue around insurance, because insurance companies haven't caught up yet with the fact that our employees are working from home, and therefore our tentacles are out there, because insurance for SMEs is very focused on, you know, the headquarters, wherever that happens to be, or the main premises of the business. So insurance companies have a bit of work to do here to actually catch up and embrace what we're trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I mean, Mark, and from the kind of policy angle, I mean, is there any issues in some of the things that have been raised there about kind of the workplace?
I mean, all of that has been said resonates with most of the work that I've been doing over the last 2 or 3 years. Quality line management is absolutely crucial. That is the most important thing when it comes to enabling flexible working, but also ensuring that any well-being concerns are taken into account as well. The difficulty, of course, is that very often there is not enough management training. Managers don't feel trained enough to manage their teams. By the way, there's also a big difference in how to manage a hybrid team and how to manage a remote team, fully remote team as well. And us at the CIPD, I think we put a bit of effort in trying to produce guides and practical, so step-by-step guides to try and help with both of those situations. But when it comes to things like the always-on culture, now that certainly was a concern, and you know, Denise mentioned this in her opening remarks. We speak a lot about productivity, and there's been lots of these sort of sensationalist headlines how working from home has improved productivity. I don't think I would be quite as quick to conclude that. The results are probably a bit mixed. All depends on how you define productivity, etc., etc., etc. But also may well be that this element of work intensification, of people just, you know, switching off the computer at 5:30 and then at 6 p.m. Checking emails on their phone, you know, that may well have an impact there as well. But then the long-term impact of that on stress levels and workload levels are significant. Relationships were mentioned as well, and actually all the research that we've done in the past actually suggests that relationships at work are probably some of the strongest predictors of job quality and things like job satisfaction as well. And what we know is that those that work from home all the time tend to report better relationships with managers, which actually makes sense because, as I said, good management is an enabler of flexible working. But they report poorer relationships with their colleagues, which actually is one of the things that everybody was worried about during the pandemic. So again, it goes back to managers to try and ensure that some of these concerns are taken into account, and there's, you know, bits of socializing, for example, built in into the schedule, that there's boundaries being set, that managers, for example, also lead by example, and they don't send emails at 10 p.m. because they don't expect to receive emails at 10 p.m., for example.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, sorry.
No, I could talk about this for ages. I think the important thing is to recognize the individual circumstances as well. And of course, it's very easy to generalize, but it's actually the impact of various other characteristics that are so incredibly important, things like caring responsibilities as well, disabilities, for example, as well. These groups of employees will all have very different experiences of work and working from home as well. And the final point that I want to make, and something that we've always been emphasizing, is that flexible working is not just about home working or hybrid working. We've got about 32% of jobs that simply cannot be done from home at all. You've got another 8% of people who do not want to work from home at all because it doesn't suit them, they don't have the premises, they don't have the technology, whatever. That's 40% of employees in Northern Ireland who, if they can't work from home or hybridly, they simply don't have flexible working. So it's incredibly important that we, again, educate managers as well, and also employees about the the plethora of other flexible working options as well. Job sharing, compressed hours, well, reduced hours is an option as well, term time working, etc. Many, many different options out there.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you very much, Marek, for that. I mean, I'm just picking up on this issue about being always on and actually setting policies for email use and when people are available to be in touch. And I don't know, I mean, this is something, Michelle, maybe you want to pick up on. I mean, this idea, we think about kind of, and you touched on this before, about the kind of flexibility, the kind of more nimble type entrepreneur, smaller micro organization. I mean, is that harder for those types of organizations than perhaps larger, who are able to, legislate for this and set policies for use of technology and after hours work and those sorts of things? Is that, I mean, or is that just a stereotype that we're thinking about? Does it go back to I mean, a strong entrepreneur being able to actually get that message out?
Yeah, I think there's a mixture out there. I think there is a bit of a preconception of the culture is in small businesses, certainly within key personnel within a small business, that they're always on, they're always available to the business owner. And to a certain extent, that is part of the relationship. But, a good small business owner, like a good line manager, will be thinking about the well-being of their staff as well. So it's actually a bit more, I think, because we have more of a culture of it, there's probably more of an ability to set boundaries. So there would be more of an understanding, maybe it would be employee driven rather than probably the small business owner. The employee would be saying, here's when I'm okay with this and here's when I'm not. But I think the problem is that there's so much juggling going on now. It's almost acceptable, to do some of the other flexible things that you need to do in your day. And then, you could be writing tenders at 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night. And it's, it's that background work that sometimes I think is a bit invisible. And I think, sadly, a lot of the onus is on the employee almost to make that be seen, rather than actually the small business owners pick up on it, because quite often they won't.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you've really hit another big issue there in terms of this idea. I mean, and whenever we were very much working in the more traditional sense, managers could see how much people were working on, if you're taking, for example, tenders or those sorts of things, which take an enormous amount of background work, and you could see somebody's working on that all day on it or whatever. Whereas whenever it's not so visible, then does that maybe get lost and you forget that the amount of time it does, all those kind of pieces of the job which take a lot longer than sometimes is appreciated by managers and by owners as well. And again, it goes back to this, really understand what people are doing in their everyday jobs and occupations.
Yeah, I think one of the keys to the success of it, to be honest, and it's not within the SME culture, but it's beginning to seep in a little bit because of what's going on, is a performance review system, and to actually put in decent performance review systems with target setting. And it becomes much more focused about results rather than those inputs, which is back to what Denise was saying at the very beginning. But getting small businesses to put in, they don't have to be complicated. They can be, in fact, they shouldn't be complicated. And you could use, whether you have 2 staff or 20 staff or 30 staff, and you have this sort of regular target setting, understanding, looking at training. And the other thing, when you're talking about training for line managers, small business owners, quite frankly, think they don't need to have training. So this whole change in culture is about them also beginning to think, how can I best do that? And we're just a bit slow to catch up on that process. But for me, I think performance review systems, target setting, keeping it uncomplicated, and helping people and training people, and not making the mental health an add-on, actually making that part and parcel of employment, and understanding, I think, is key.
Yeah, absolutely.
Martin, can I just make it, I think, which is a very important point, because we talked an awful lot about the role of line managers here, in terms of, firstly, you know, adapting to hybrid management, adapting maybe to new performance reviews and a performance management model, and providing kind of initiatives and ensuring good relationships with their employees, I suppose, you know, to protect well-being. What about the line management well-being in all this? What about their jobs? They you know, we're seeing more and more that line managers are expected to do more and more, and you know that, and we have seen actually in our research that their well-being was particularly affected, because they felt a responsibility to do as much as they could for those who they were managing, but as well did not get the support from leaders at the higher end of the organisation in terms of their well-being, or in terms of time and resources and so on. So I think it's really important not to forget the very critical role of line managers, but the fact that, you know, it's so difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely what you said. I mean, it's like everything else. Everything has been kind of accentuated and emphasized. I mean, we've always had that issue about the kind of middle manager, the muddle in the middle, the person who is kind of, you know, damned if they do, damned if they don't sometimes. But as this kind of really, you know, their sense of responsibility and their sense of kind of, you know, I have to make this work, because they're in the fire line a lot of the time. I think that it's like everything else. Whenever we're introducing new things and new ways of working are actually happening, then unfortunately it's the middle manager sometimes is at the brunt of that, because, you know, people look to them, what do I do here? But then they're also getting senior leaders ask them what has actually happened as well. So I think that's a really important point, and we need to think about that. So how do we think about the well-being? How do we think about the performance of middle managers as well? You know, just in terms of, I'm conscious of time here and we've covered quite a lot of ground, but, you know, in terms of, you know, the chat here, is anyone got anything that they'd like us to any questions or anything about, you know, things that happened in their workplace, or any kind of practical takeaways, you know, that we can think about? And again, I'm Daria's keeping me right here in terms of just remember to ask each speaker one or two practical takeaways before we move on to
the so we can start like with Marek, for example. Marek, if you were to tell the audience one or two things that they can take to their organization or to their practice, what would you tell them?
I mean, I'll just be repeating myself, but I'll do that anyway. One is that please don't forget about other forms of flexibility. I think many different things can shape a sort of culture of an organization, but the way trust happens and can be undermined between various groups of employees is something that has to really be kept in mind. And if you are facing a situation where you have got employees who cannot work from home and you've got employees who can work from home, and you don't look at other forms of flexibility, you are basically risking this two-tier workforce where one group has flexible working because they can work from home, and the other group does not have flexible working because they can't work from home. If you expand the definition a little bit further, that allows you to address some of these tensions. The other type of tension to keep in mind, of course, is on the relationship front, which is you've got people who work at home, especially when it comes to hybrid teams, people who are constantly in meetings and then just dial in externally for others. There's ways of managing this, for example, by thinking of even if you are in the office, trying to be virtual first, trying to basically log in through your computer, even if you are in the office, just to sort of create the same sort of sense of, I guess, involvement from everybody, rather than those on the outside. I don't know, two people being on this massive screen in a meeting room, trying to get in. So there are things to basically keep in mind. And then lastly, all of this is underpinned by good, open, honest, regular communication and conversations, and that is absolutely key.
Okay, thank you, Marek. Denise, if I could turn to you, any kind of just key takeaways that you would say that might be useful for the audience in terms of how do we make this work?
Yeah, I think we've talked about an awful lot today, but I suppose one thing we haven't talked about, which I'm quite keen just to raise before just to sign off on, is the issues around equality, diversity and inclusion. So on one hand, we have hybrid models and remote working, given the potential to facilitate more inclusion of marginalised groups, people with disabilities, people with caring responsibilities and so on. We also have the opportunities, to create more connections and interactions both internally and externally. So that's all great. And, there's potential to widen the labour pool as well, with more kind of workforce models. It also dispels kind of this notion of hierarchy, in a way that evidence has been suggests that the individuals, when they're seeing people from the screen working at home, it levels people's playing fields a little bit. But on the other hand, you do have real issues in terms of this hybrid model where, for example, women may be more likely to adopt more days working at home for flexibility. Shouldn't be the case, but that is the way it is. What's the effect of that? Do they feel excluded in meetings, in hybrid meetings? I remember one example which really has struck home to me is don't have a meeting outside the meeting. Because that essentially, it's all those little informal chats before and after the meeting that then excludes those people in a hybrid mode. And that potentially then excludes them from important decision making and influencing that decision, and then has potential on career progression and how they're perceived in the organisation. So I suppose don't have a meeting outside the meeting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great advice, but it's very difficult because
I know.
People are friendly and try to be each other, and sometimes they escalate into a meeting anyway. Even if you don't want to.
Maybe I should qualify as don't make decisions. Maybe,
okay,
but
okay.
It's one. It made me think a little bit anyway when I heard that piece of advice. And to be honest, I can't even remember to attribute to who it was. It might have been. Anyway, I can't remember, but yeah, so it's taking that EDI lens as well in terms of all these decisions, ensuring that you're having kind of representation as well and consulting employees from a range of different representative groups to influence your decision or to contribute to that decision making, and that's really, really key.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Michelle, what about you? Just a key takeaway or two?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that working from home and flexible working is creating for us is that actually there's an emergence, I suppose, of more employee choice. I mean, in Northern Ireland, we are in the northwest periphery of Europe, and actually some work being done by women in business here in Northern Ireland is showing that women are now actually able to get employment in different types of jobs in different locations because of more online working. So in a way, that's a positive thing for women overall in terms of maybe negotiation of salaries, etc. But in terms then, I suppose, of employers and small businesses, our challenge, I think, is to make sure that we are supporting and retaining our good employees. And, SMEs, they put a lot of investment because they don't have a lot. They put up a lot of investment into developing people into key skills in the business, and they almost become like key person people, another almost partner in the business. So there's a lot of energy goes into that. And so I think employee retention is a big one in terms of us considering that and making sure that we keep that. I mean, again, in terms of just not repeating myself from earlier, but I think some of the things, SMEs are taking and need to take a longer term approach to implement the policies and procedures that we need for this, for working from home. We certainly need to do that. And we need a sort of 3-year time frame. And I think in some ways larger organizations can do it easier, if that makes sense, because there's just more infrastructure. And then planning for that change, and then lobbying, I suppose, in terms of insurance companies, but definitely getting more target focused and getting more performance and making training much more an important part of running a business.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. so those are some of the kind of key takeaways. And again, we were thinking that this idea very much kind of think about longer term strategy from Michelle, and again, Denise's idea about this idea of meetings within meetings, etc., those sorts of things. And again, Marek's ideas about trust, etc., and good management. Just I'm noticed just a couple of questions here. Colin's obviously asking about this idea of kind of agile project manifesto. I mean, Colin, I don't know, do you want to maybe explain what this is all about? I have to admit, I'm maybe not fully au fait with this. Do not just check on the system here. Oh, Colin has no mic. That's okay. I mean, just in terms of this idea of kind of co-located agile development teams, you know, post-pandemic, this idea of development teams been co-located. Is any kind of thoughts about that from the panel? No.
I mean, co-location in general is something that is certainly being explored, and there is a public policy element to it as well. So you've got, for example, the Welsh government has decided over the last couple of years to start establishing like remote working hubs, which allow you to, well, work not from home, but work away from the office, but work somewhere that is near your home. It also allows you to actually use a different space slightly differently. I think one of them is a pub. The former pub has been created into a sort of co-location workspace. Now, there's conflicting views on whether this is the right thing to do or not, but I think it's certainly an interesting experiment. I sort of look forward to following whether there's been any sort of success. But you know, co-location in general, I mean, I think it will become a bigger issue. I mean, Michelle mentioned estates and infrastructure and all that, and you know, it may well be businesses will start working together a lot closer.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think it's something that we're seeing, you know, particularly given the kind of rural nature of I mean, Michelle certainly mentioned this idea of Northern Ireland, but certainly in Ireland in general, you're seeing examples of this in some of the kind of West Coast communities, this idea of trying to create rural development, you know, by creating hubs to get, you know, people who traditionally may have had to travel, maybe not all the time to the bigger urban centres, but now you've been able to stay in those rural locations. So again, rural renewal and development might well be something which we're seeing a trend in the longer term as well as a result of what has actually happened here. So yeah, it's a really good question, and I think this idea of creating those hubs might well be a very useful way, and again, solving some of those estates issues that Michelle very kind of, you know, accurately brought up as well. Okay.
I think one of the things actually to take from the small business sector on that, you know, if that's a way of moving forward, clustering and the clustering of sectors and industries. So if you're creating those hubs around clusters where people can actually identify with each other in terms of their work, that would be an interesting thing to probably have a look at.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just conscious of time here, and I think it's amazing how time kind of moves on. Daria has just mentioned that we've got a quick feedback poll. If we'd really appreciate if you would complete that, that would allow us to you know, think about what we can do in terms of these moving forward, these sessions. But at this point, I would just like to thank everyone for coming along, and a big thank you to our speakers, Denise, Marek, and Michelle, who have been really giving some interesting and insightful comments. I think, you know, some of the takeaways from this, very much the importance of trust, the importance of keeping close and good conversations, good, honest conversations. I mean, a phrase that our Vice Chancellor in the university talks about is the kind of sticky campus. And I think that almost applies to the workplace as well. How do we make workplaces sticky where, you know, people can really come in and want to be there, and there's a purpose? You're not just there, as Denise mentioned, sitting on a Teams call. You're there for a real reason, for a real purpose, and that allows people to really develop and develop good ideas, develop new practices, and be able to do their job in a way that they want to, that's going to suit them as well. So again, you know, lots of things we could talk about this to the cows come home, but there's, you know, I think we've had some really interesting discussions today. And again, I want to thank you very much for coming along. And I hope that, you know, you'll be able to review the video and the slides and the recording as well, if that's useful for you going forward. So thank you very much, everyone.